Good morning, class. This is our last lecture, and for this lecture we are moving from Europe to America, United States in the 20th century. We're going to pick up a little bit of what's going on in American art there, and I'm going to start with two really important groups in early 20th century American modernism. One group was founded and kind of led by Robert Henri. You're looking here at a Robert Henri painting, New York street scene in winter. Henri was a committed realist and also in his work really committed to the idea that art is linked directly to life. Some of the movements we've looked at, like aestheticism, you could say are art about art, or art for art's sake. Henri would disagree with that. He would say, no, it's art for life's sake. And he was very committed to wading out into the street, meeting people, interacting with people, drawing from the street experience, bringing that back to the studio, and making finished works that express the vibrancy of very contemporary life. He also was very interesting sociologically. He's very committed to working people, common people, the kids who lived in the street in those days, and was quite resistant to upper class, aristocratic class. He favored kind of an art as a gritty experience, as you can see here in New York street scene. And it was also important because he founded an art school, and a number of his students became very important American artists in their own right, and they're all committed to this kind of social, political, gritty daily life realism. And in fact, they formed a group that exhibited together. There were 8 of them, and so they called their group the 8, and had exhibitions of the 8. However, when they began exhibiting, and critics looked at the content of their work, which kind of went in the face of American ideas about beauty. The kind of general American idea was art should be about beauty, not about grittiness. And one critic in his complaint about the 8 said that he wasn't sure they were the 8. He said, I think they might be better called the ashcan school. So it seemed to him they were mostly making art out of the alleyways and the ash cans of back alleys. And that actually became their nickname. So that it's also fair to call them the Ashcan School. I want to dive in and look a little bit at Henri. You've been looking at this painting of the New York street scene. Let me make a couple comments about it to get us going on the Henri Ashcan aesthetic. Obviously it's a picture of a city street, and that's actually really important right off the bat. American culture is shifting its center from the countryside, from agrarian farming to industry and the big city. And so the city becomes one of the tropes for modernism. And Henri is wading right into the city. As you can see, the city then was not quite as polished as it is now. Dirt roads, buildings are not skyscrapers yet. But he takes that on with a loose brush, even working with his palette knife, muddy colors, and within the realm of realism, a kind of a stylized realism, a very kind of soft focus, kind of crude application of the paint to make us feel the city. Let's look at another one. Here's a second painting by Henri, a portrait of Eva Green. This is very typical of Henri. He, aside from cityscapes, his favorite all-time theme was people. Portraits, actually portraits a lot. And in this case, he's taken a girl from the street. Remember, he's living in New York City. Lots of tenement and ghetto neighborhoods in New York City, and he tends to favor people who are, quote, on the margins of our society. So in this case, he's championing a young African-American girl that he's gotten to know. Typically, he would pay them to sit for him out of a sense of justice, and then would just celebrate them. For the day, this is actually a very radical painting because he's choosing a child from a lower class who is a different color, and celebrating her, giving her great dignity, vibrancy, and intelligence. And this is Henry's way of protesting the injustices. He's not portraying her as a victim of race or poverty, but more he's saying, look at her beauty. And his kind of choppy way of painting, this kind of Rembrandt-like, Franz Hals-like way of painting, really serves to give her that kind of immediacy of presence. You'll notice too the spontaneous pose as she's seated there kind of sideways to us, and then turns her head, turns her eyes into the corner of her eyes, her mouth parts a bit, as if he's captured kind of a vibrant moment where she sort of turned her head up and makes eye contact with us. I want to look at one other painting from the group, the 8, or the Ashcan. Unfortunately, in a survey class, we don't have time to look at all 8 of them. But let's look at one work by George Bellows. I think one of the best painters in the group, actually. Here our subject is lone tenement. So this is a really crucial theme, and to our eyes, this doesn't necessarily stand out because we're so accustomed to cities, development, redevelopment, neighborhoods going bad, neighborhoods coming back through gentrification. But the big city is a new phenomena here, and immigration is huge, and so there's all kinds of neighborhoods that are developing, and that's complex, and that's a phenomena that the Ashcan School was interested in. So here Bellows is giving us a very urban scene. We're kind of in a bare field. In fact, we're in what was a tenement neighborhood where lots of the buildings had been torn down, and only that one lone tenement remains standing, kind of a tower, a monument, a shack. And we're here under the elevated railroad. You can see there at the top right corner, going on a diagonal with the sun just hitting its edge, that elevated track above. And that accounts for all the shadow in the foreground of the painting here. And there you see all sorts of guys gathered around a fire. They started in a barrel to keep warm on this wintry day. And then you can see off into the distance the Hudson River, off across the river into New Jersey. A little tugboat steaming its way up the river there. And in the background, the sunlight actually falling on this urban scape in a rather fresh but cool, cold way. Bellows has just captured almost the temperature, certainly the light, but also the living conditions of this little slice of a tenement neighborhood that's on its way to being torn down. So this is the sense of really art should engage with life, right? Art's for life's sake, and it's depicting, celebrating, sometimes protesting the conditions of our society. Now, there's sort of 2 branches of art that are dominating American art at the time. One is kind of a beautified, academic, very traditional, and that's sort of the main sweep of art at the time. Another is realism, and more gritty realism, as I was just showing you with the Henry circle. In the midst of that comes another tendency, which is the influence of European modernism, and you've studied that now. So, so Van Gogh, Gauguin, Matisse, Picasso, Kandinsky, Duchamp. These works begin to find their way over to American culture, and many Americans are quite perplexed by them, are very resistant to abstraction or to expressionism. Many Americans tend to think that realism and academic idealization is what art is. Into that comes European modernism. And it came in a very interesting moment in bulk, which was in 1913, an art exhibition that got nicknamed the Armory Show. It had a longer fancy name, which was the Third International Exhibition of Modern Art. So this is an interesting show. It was organized by Americans who thought that America ought to be more aware of what's going on in Europe. and also wanted to place contemporary American art next to contemporary European art. So they sent a delegation to Europe who traveled about and secured loans of rooms full of European modernism, late 19th and early 20th century European advanced art. They brought it over, they mounted an exhibition in what was the old Armory in New York, hence the nickname the Armory Show. This was a massive show, and then they put a bunch of American art in as well. When this show opened, it was highly controversial. The American public went nuts. People were shocked. They had not seen work like this, and people tended to love it or hate it. One of the paintings that you'll remember from the lecture on Marcel Duchamp, Nude Descending a Staircase, that painting was in this show, and Americans reacted so strongly to that the guards said that at night they had to wash the painting every night because so many Americans spit on it. So that gives you a feeling for their reactions. Well, there was a group of young American artists led by a man named Alfred Stieglitz, who we'll look at in a moment, that fell in love with modernism. And out of that comes what is sometimes referred to as the Stieglitz Circle of young, more advanced modernists, young American artists, and the abstract kick is on, and that rises up next to the realist tradition that the Henry School is favoring, and makes for a very lively debate about art in American culture. So what you're looking at here is a photo of part of the installation of the Armory Show. Let's look at Stieglitz first. So Stieglitz was a photographer, and in fact he's one of the people that really established the idea that photography could be an art form, an art medium. Previously, photography was largely seen more as documentation or amateur art, and so he believed it could be an art form, and I'll speak about that in just a moment. But first, we've got to talk about Stieglitz himself. Now, Stieglitz is actually an older generation. He's well established. He immigrated here as a child from Europe, but he had deep European connections, and he was very aware of what was going on in modern art in Europe. And he thought that America should see that kind of work. So in addition to being an influential photographer, he became an influential gallerist. He opened a gallery at 291 Fifth Avenue, which got nicknamed the 291 Gallery. And there he brought over small shows from Europe, Rodin, Van Gogh, a whole bunch of others. And his gallery was almost the only place that the person off the street could walk in and see European modernism for some time. Stieglitz ran a variety of galleries clear up through the late 1930s. So it's a very significant figure as a curator and educator of the American public and a bridge between Europe and America. Now, in his own work, he thought photography should be an art form, and so he sought a way to use the photograph aesthetically. And you're looking here at the terminal. This is where the trolley line pulled by horses comes to its end and turns on a round track to go back down to run downtown the other direction. And of course, what he appreciates about this is not so much the street as a gritty place of life, the way Henry and his circle did, but more the street as an aesthetic experience. So he finds at a time of day, it's a cold winter day, and the sweaty, hot horses, their bodies are putting off steam, and he finds a composition that's very aesthetically pleasing. He uses a lens setting for depth of field and shutter speed to make this slightly soft focus. Some people refer to him as an impressionist of photography, linking the idea of a painting aesthetic to a photographic aesthetic. And this is part of Stieglitz's contribution to find the beauty that the camera can reveal. So he favors a more aesthetic approach, a little bit more of an art for art's sake approach. Now he was super charismatic, and a lot of young American artists who were fascinated by European modernism gathered around him. He often actually supported them financially. A couple of them he supported for a whole year so that they could find their way as young artists. And out of that, he stimulates a movement that we're going to call early American modernism. So Arthur Dove is one of the artists that gathers into this group around Stieglitz. Dove is a terrific painter, and he's very much liking this kind of aesthetic idea, a little bit like we encountered with Whistler in aestheticism, where the artist is not so interested in depicting a scene as in a document or a representation, but instead the artist is interested in poetically evoking the feeling of a scene, the inner emotional experience we get as our eyeballs look onto a certain scene and our bodies feel it. And you can really sense that here, the wreck of the ferry, where we're down on a waterfront. There's thick fog receding off into the distance. A ferry boat has gone aground, and it doesn't want anyone to collide with it, so it sounds its foghorn out through the fog as a warning. If you've been in thick fog near water, you know how that feels. It's not so much how it looks, but how it feels, and the way sound echoes and haunts through the fog. So Dove's interested in evoking that kind of feeling, that the experience of that more than the recording the surface of that. And so he finds shapes and colors that get that. Notice, for example, the warning signal there. He picks as concentric circles of kind of brown, black, orange, beige, emanating out towards us. This is the way we think of sound traveling, right, as it expands outward. But then because it's sort of a sharp note in a very cool, foggy scene, that orange radiates off that kind of green, the color complement, and the grays and the whites. So that it's like, how do you paint a sound? Well, he's figured out how to paint that in the feeling of the fog. So a very poetic, evocative way of painting is part of what happens in this Stieglitz circle. I want to look at one other Arthur Dove because it's important to establish this way of working. And I do encourage you to think about what we talked about with Whistler, that idea that the artist should produce an aesthetic emotion, and to do that, the artist needs to find the significant form. Now, I actually don't know if Dove ever had read Clive Bell, but certainly that overall way of thinking permeates early modernism. So I think it becomes nicely clear here, where you see Dove, who was always interested in nature and landscape, the feelings of it, takes as his theme nature. This is on one level a landscape, except he doesn't want to make a picture of nature. Instead, he wants to evoke what it is that moves him in nature. And so he simplifies natural forms into abstract forms. Curling forms hit us one way emotionally, jagged forms hit us another way emotionally. Right? These tend to be earth tones with a bit of blue for sky worked in. But then he acknowledges that the shapes he's taken actually work like symbols. And that's how a symbol is. Symbols are always grounded in optical reality, but they're radically simplified and abstracted so that they reference a concept. And so a symbol hovers exactly between natural reality and abstract concept. That's part of why symbols are so profound. They're kind of universal that way. And so here he's asking himself, if I think what moves me in nature, can I, so to speak, symbolize that, make a symbolic landscape of nature? Now, part of what he's interested in here, as is this whole circle, is what was a very big philosophical idea at the time, which is the notion of the life force. That nature is not just disparate objects, rocks and deer and fish and water, but that through all of nature, there is a life force, a biological drive of life itself. And they're interested in that. How do you paint that kind of quality? So it's a really interesting kind of deep dive aesthetically and formally in order to kind of convey something poetically about nature and where we are and have our being. Marston Hartley is another of the Stieglitz circle. And here you're looking at a painting by Hartley called Portrait of a German Officer. Hartley actually did travel to Germany. He studied art in Germany as well as in America. And while he was in Germany, this is before World War I, while he was in Germany, he became friends with a couple of German officers. I'm not quite sure that the military connection is a big deal. I don't know how he met these guys, but anyway, they became very intimate friends. One of them, Karl von Freiberg, and you can see his initials there in the lower left corner of the painting. So Hartley here is painting a portrait of him. Now, obviously, this is a symbolic portrait, not a realistic or naturalistic portrait. And it goes to this very point that we were just discussing with Dove. That what interests is something more of the essence that comes through a kind of an aesthetic expression rather than a depiction. And so here he takes his friend. He gives us a composition that is figurative. This is a vertical, narrow rectangle with a stack of forms that rise up, and it is almost like the half-length portrait. In fact, the circular form at the top is reminiscent of a head, and as it moves out, you have a feel of shoulders and torso. But what he wants to do is signify his friend symbolically, and so he takes symbolic elements that are part of his friend's identity. He was a military officer, so there's elements here taken from his uniform, elements taken from German military culture. You can see the German flag there in the lower third, the striped red, white, and black form. You can see one of the epaulets from the corner, from the shoulder of his uniform, and so on. And it becomes this really kind of terrific indirect or oblique portrait evoking his feelings about this friend as a military officer. So an abstract way of working. Of course, Hartley is a very good painter and a brilliant composer, and he gets a very moving quality. Now, his feel for paint is he likes very thick paint. He likes to overpaint, underpaint. So you get kind of a weightiness, a gravitas about his work. Dove's, on the other hand, is more luminous than thinner washes of paint. But this is more Hartley's. He has a heavier hand, a more somber kind of feel. Now, I want to look at one other Hartley. Here's a second painting by Hartley, Landscape, New Mexico. And I'm showing you this because it allows me to talk about something that was true of almost every artist in the Stieglitz circle. Namely that in their early work, when they're first encountering modernism and abstraction and these radical avant-garde ideas, almost all of them did go to a place of near pure abstraction. And then almost all of them backed away from that in their mid and late work, kind of seeking a regrounding in nature. And there is something about the American psyche that is sort of pragmatic and realistic and likes that grounding. Pure abstraction is too theoretical for the American imagination in a way, although that's a dumb thing to say because lots of Americans do work purely abstractly. But I think in this early period, when they're testing out what abstracting and expressionism is about, they tend to like this kind of grounding. So here we have a New Mexico landscape where Hartley has simplified it. He's found the colors in nature and exaggerated them. He's simplified the forms, given them strong borders. So you feel a very weighty, almost metaphysical, and yet color-rich kind of poetry of the landscape. George O'Keeffe is another of the Stieglitz circle. She also plays a special role in the Stieglitz circle in that she and Stieglitz were married. They're one of the power art couples in American art history. but she's very independent in her own art. In her early career, while they're married living in New York and Stieglitz is running his galleries and so on, she takes on the city as a subject matter. And here, really wonderful view of city night. You might compare this to the Robert Henry Winter Street in New York that I began with. And there you'll really feel the art for life's sake versus here the kind of art for art's sake approach. But in both cases, the city is a major theme. So here, O'Keeffe wants to give us that sort of essence of the experience of the city. And as she herself said in interviews, what's at the heart of your feeling of the city is these canyons, not natural canyons like the Grand Canyon, but urban canyons where there's a narrow street and then high-rise buildings soar up into the sky. So she wants us to give us that feeling. And look how wonderfully she does it in the composition. You'll notice that she does not actually show you the street itself or the sidewalks. Instead, it's like you're standing there tipping your head back, looking up at the high rise of these buildings. And she's cut off the ground so that all you feel is the rise. And then these buildings rise on a bit of diagonals leaning in towards each other. But in fact, she has abstracted this into very flat, abstract shapes. Take your eye and look at that upper left corner, for example, where you see a black triangle. That's nothing but a flat black triangle. Next to that is a gray form tapering. Next to that, a black form. Then there's the space between the buildings. It's kind of a jagged, darker gray form. Then the white of that building, then black, gray, black, gray. These are really very flat, abstract shapes composed. They just minimally enough depict what they are referencing to help us feel space and building and light. Really subtle, really poetically evoking the feeling of the city at night. Or like similarly, Red Hills and Bones, where she finds this poetic rhyme between the shapes of the bones, like say those spinal column vertebrae there, and then that hill behind it with the way the water has eroded those little rivulets, so that there's a kind of repeated shape in that red hill that's like the vertebrae in the foreground. She loved these bones, not because they were symbolic of death, but for their formal, abstract quality. And in the end, she's leveraging off nature and the spirit of nature, but she's an abstract painter, a formalist, finding really rich, wonderful forms. All right, now there's a number of other Stieglitz Circle modernists, but again, in a survey class, we can't do everybody. So I want to move to another dimension of American art that's going on, especially in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. We're going to return to a kind of realism here. We're looking here at a painting by Edward Hopper, and it might be a painting that you know. It's a very popular painting. So Hopper is also dealing with the city. He does rural scenes too, but a lot of city scenes, and very much dealing with the ethos of the city and of city life. For him, that's a lonely place. There's all these buildings around, there's habitation all around, but typically only a few figures that are isolated and kind of framed, almost trapped sometimes by the architectural forms. He finds these really wonderful metaphors to play off of. This painting, Nighthawks, relies very heavily on one of those, which is the metaphor of interior versus exterior, inner versus outer, belonging versus being alone. So here he gives us an interior shape, an interior space there in that, I don't know, coffee shop, let's just call it, where you see people in a well-lit space at night, but you yourselves are outside where we're looking in, and you feel we're alone and they're together, except they're not really that together, are they? So this painting evokes a very powerful mood. Now, we easily say that Hopper's a realist, but in fact, Hopper is a genius on the abstract level, because if you start looking at the way he composes shapes to evoke these moods, he's very, very aware of shapes, subtle shapes. Let's look at two ways that that's clear. Let's start over there in the upper left part of the painting. You see that building across the street, and if you look at the second floor, the windows, the red brick walls, and then the windows, some of the shades are up, some are half down, which poetically evokes what's going on inside those rooms. But look at the actual shapes he uses. Look at the green shades where light and shadow fall on them, or the black opening of the window. Look at that center one where you see a little gray triangle on the window jamb next to the black. Above that, it's a green. Look at that little gray triangle again. Now drop your eye down to the street level of that building, to the right window of that building, and you'll see a light gray triangle repeated there. And that's actually part of a larger gray triangle, part of it seen through the glass. Move over now to that woman in the red dress. Look at the window jamb just to the right of her. Move your eye up to where it meets the ceiling, and you see there two shadow triangles. Okay, if you look for geometric shapes and move through a Hopper painting, you find them repeated over and over. This is true of rectangles and triangles and all sorts of forms that he uses. So on the abstract level, he builds a painting, and that's part of why they have such power to root us in this sort of silent, frozen space that he creates. Now let's look at another of his subtleties here. So on the narrative level. So here we are outside. We're looking in to this night scene, and we see people in there. Look at the composition of those people. Let's start with the man with his back to us in the gray suit. So he's alone. He grounds almost the center of the painting. Notice how very subtly he's framed by the rectangle of a door across the street. It's very blurry, but you see it through there. So there's a geometric grid going across from that building behind him, and that grid is locating these figures in the center ground. So the guy with his back to us, he's kind of locked into that grid that's in deeper space. Then if you move just to the right, you see the sugar shaker and the napkin holder on the counter. Then a gap. Then the other man seated there, more facing us. Tiny gap, woman seated there. A little bit bigger gap, the guy who works the counter. Then two coffee urns little gap, and then a door. I want you to notice the rhythm of that. Okay, single figure, two elements on the counter, space. Two figures, space. One figure, two figures, space. Single door is figure. Okay, there's a rhythm to that. And the spacing between these elements is just right so that you have a feeling that, yeah, these people belong in society, they're together, maybe that's even a couple, and yet each one is very isolated, alienated. Over and over, Hopper gets this quality of American life, and the critics really picked up on it. They said that no one depicted the sort of strange quality of American life where we're all together and yet we're all loners. It's very much about the individualism of American society, where we're one, but we're alone, even when we're in a group. And then lastly, the way he portrays light in this is very powerful. The light outside the building is cool. The light inside the building is much warmer. And he's got a way of evoking that atmosphere. So, really brilliant realist depicting the sort of essence, the psychological essence of American life. Let's turn to another painter who's very interested in this hybrid between realism and abstraction, between the American scene and European, more conceptual ways of thinking. And that's the painter Charles Demuth. Demuth is sometimes part of a smaller group that came to be called Precisionism, because there is a real precision in the way that he and his friends like Charles Sheeler painted. Unfortunately, you can just look at one Demuth, but I love this painting, My Egypt. Now, Demuth here is partly investigating this question that's big at the time of what is actually American culture? What's the soul and psyche of Americanness? The culture is still young, and we're trying to figure that out, and a lot of artists investigate that in the 20s and 30s. So here he's actually choosing an iconic element from the American landscape, grain elevators. Any of us grew up around here. Grain elevators are all over the place in Minnesota. And of course, that's kind of an iconic architectural structure for us that speaks to our agrarian culture, the Great Plains, our raising of grain, really an American thing. You know, Egypt has the pyramids, right? He calls this My Egypt, referencing the pyramids as the iconic architecture of Egypt, grain elevators being ours. So, terrific painting, and he centralizes those, rises them up like towers, makes them very important. But now the style with which he's painted this is interesting. It is a hybrid of realism and cubism. And the Americans kept trying to figure out, how do the Europeans do cubism? What's its inner logic? Well, Demuth here finds what I think of as an American logic for cubism. If Picasso looked at this, he would not say this is a cubist painting at all. He would say it's a failure, that Demuth doesn't even understand the intellectual internal concepts going on in cubism. But Demuth does like this sort of geometricizing, modernizing of the image. However, here he finds a kind of natural way to do cubism, because if you look at this and ask yourself, what's the logic of his divisions there? Those lines that divide up geometric kind of a puzzle to the image. The logic is actually power lines. He's been looking at the power lines, and if you go out and look at power lines, they are little black lines that divide up the space. If you look at the space between the power lines and think of that as an abstract shape, you find that a modern environment with lots of power lines is sort of already sliced up in a sort of cubistic way. It's simple, it's direct, very American, and it makes it pretty wonderful. Now, I mentioned precisionism, and Demuth's fellow precisionist Charles Sheeler. Let's take a moment and look at a Sheeler. Here Time's a killer, because Sheeler is a major painter, but he's also very big as a photographer. And I've chosen to show you a photograph as opposed to a painting. So please do a Google image search of Charles Sheeler. He's well worth looking at. But I wanted to bring this photograph in front of you because it's capturing all these things that the precisionists and those asking the American question are interested in. It's a photograph of a factory, and not any factory, a Ford factory, an automobile factory, very American. It is like my Egypt. I mean, this is like the factory as monument, as iconic structure. But what I want you to notice in that light is the way Sheeler manages to capture both the realism and the abstraction of this. Much like Demas My Egypt, Sheeler here has found a way to focus his camera, to develop his print, to use half tones and full tones, to create what is actually a very abstract image. Those sort of conveyor belt structures in the factory are like a big abstract X, going across the composition. And yet you read this very clearly as a architectural place in space. Now, this is part of the thing that is also going on in American culture of just really celebrating city, factory, industry. Today we're a lot more concerned about that negatively because of pollution and environmental issues. But these were new at the time, and they were seen as the sort of rising, throbbing power of the vigorous American culture, and so they are really being celebrated. All right, let's go to another artist from this time. I want to look next at Stuart Davis, a major painter of the time. Davis also extremely interested in this hybrid of realism and abstraction. In fact, as a art student, he was a member of Robert Henry's School of Art and began as an ashcan painter with that kind of gritty street realism. He then encountered the Armory Show, saw abstract European art, and fell in love with abstraction, but was not quite sure how one got there logically. And so as a young artist, he's got, ashcan realism and abstract Europeanism, one in each hand. And much of his career is a way of working out how to synthesize or reconcile those. He ends up creating a very, very original body of work, very intelligent body of work. We'll look at one painting by him, House and Street. So what you see here, very quickly you recognize this is a sort of a evocation and abstraction of a street in New York. You see the planes of architecture. You even see some signage, some graphic design fonts there, a little symbol of the Bell Telephone, high-rise buildings, blue sky in the back, and so on. So you quickly know where you are, but it's fragmented into these very lively, syncopated, almost jazz-like forms with really brilliant colors. I say jazz-like intentionally because Davis was deeply in love with jazz. In fact, he personally knew all the great jazz musicians, and he thought of the idea that a painting could be a sort of visual music with the syncopated rhythms of jazz, with little popping colors here and there, and that is one of his influences. Now, you can quickly take this in, and it's quite satisfying, but if you look longer, you start to figure out something else Davis is doing that's really brilliant. So look at the outer perimeters of the painting first. You see on the left a blue form, like a border, and then the other three sides a kind of red border form. Just within that, you see a black border that runs on three sides within that blue and red border. And you also see that black border divides the painting down the middle with a black form. So that within this black border element on the left, there's a square through which you see that orange building with the green and red Smith sign. On the right, within that black border, is a trapezoid through which you see red and blue forms of the city out there. What are those two shapes, the square and the trapezoid? Well, what you're actually seeing there is a view out the windows of a Ford automobile, Model A Ford automobile. On the left, you're looking out the front windshield. On the right, the trapezoid, you're looking out of the corner of your eye at the tapering window of the door of the car, which is to say, you are experiencing the scene of the city from inside a machine, inside an automobile, which is driving down the street at a fairly rapid speed. In this way, Davis says he was trying to reconstruct the experience of modern vision, where we don't see the world from a static Renaissance point of view with one-point linear perspective. Instead, we see the world from motion inside of a machine, and the machine frames our consciousness, frames us like these windows, and as it moves down the street, you get glimpses. You look to your left, to your right, you get quick glimpses, but they're constantly changing because the car is moving down the street. And so he's attempted to recreate a sense of these flashes of city scenes left and right as you drive down that street. This, he said, is a truly modern mode of perception. And this is the most brilliant American adaptation of Cubism possible. I want to turn now. I'm going to turn now to another sector of American painting. We're going to look at two African American painters here, Jacob Lawrence and Romarie Bearden. We'll do Lawrence first. And this is an important moment because both of these painters are very interested in exploring the living condition and the meaning condition of African Americans. But both are doing it in a way that also is interested in this kind of hybrid of realism and abstraction that we've been talking about. There are a number of other black painters who are really dealing with the condition of racism that tend to work more realistically, a kind of propagandistic or illustrational social realism, because the forefront of their message has to do with race. Lawrence and Bearden care deeply about that, but they also care deeply about a high quality of art, and so they kind of merge European modernism with these American themes. So what you're looking at here is one of a long series of paintings that Lawrence did, dealing with the migration of Southern blacks to northern cities. This happened because racism was still so powerful in the South. Jim Crow laws and other practices had essentially kept blacks in an almost slave-like position. Northern factories were opening up and a lot of manufacturing was creating jobs. So many Southern blacks migrated northward. They did often get the jobs, but they also encountered another kind of racism. So it's not a rosy ending necessarily. But it's part of a profound sociological movement and attitudes in American culture. And Lawrence here is documenting those. So how does he work? Well, in this case, you can see dozens and dozens of Southern blacks packed up, migrating, heading to the train station, catching trains for Chicago, New York, St. Louis. And on the narrative level, that's clear enough, and you can get the theme and the issues that he cares about. But on the abstract level, he wants to give us something of the beauty and dignity here. And so he works more abstractly. He flattens shapes, he simplifies shapes. He gives us a kind of wonderful, lively, vibrant, syncopated rhythm of flat shapes and color harmonies that are very expressive. And in that way, he's really trying to find a kind of a sophisticated level of painting that celebrates the sort of soulfulness of black experience. Okay, let's do one other Lawrence panel from the Migration series. This is panel number 11, because I want to contrast it with the panel we just looked at. So the panel we just looked at conveyed this crowd thronging, right? A very complex matrix of forms and colors. In contrast, this panel is stark, right? Very simple, just a handful of minimal shapes, and it manages to convey a very different emotion as a result. Now here, our subject is a painful one. The poverty, the hunger. Food had doubled in price because of the war. And so here you see a lone African-American mother standing at the table, slicing off thin bits of bacon from a brick of fatty bacon, while her poor starving child looks on, hoping to get enough to eat. The loneliness of this, the isolation of this, the pain of this, is partly conveyed through that narrative, but is more powerfully conveyed through the abstract formal qualities of this painting. The way he has that angular red shape of her dress, that black form of her head, pitched against that green color complement of that wall, with just that lone shelf up there with a candle and a flame. Okay, just the angularity and the poignancy of that is very much on a poetic level evokes the suffering and the dignity of this scene. So that's some of the best work, right? Where kind of narrative and abstraction converge to create a very evocative image. Romare Bearden was the other African American artist I wanted to look at. Here, prevalence of ritual baptism. Bearden actually started out almost as a journalistic artist, doing political propaganda kinds of images for the Baltimore Sun, which was an African American newspaper in the early 20th century. But he soon decided that, as important as that work was, that there was another kind of work he wanted to do, which was to create a body of higher art that worked on a more symbolic, sophisticated level, to create a really rich art that celebrated African American experience, and that didn't get pigeonholed into, socially oriented political black art that tended to be propagandistic. He wanted to celebrate more of the soul of his people. Now, here's a really fine example of that. This is from a series he did dealing with ritual. Ritual, of course, is a super important part of human experience. In this case, linked to baptism. And you can see that the way he's working is also a hybrid of realistic references and abstract forms. He's here very influenced by Cubism, especially by synthetic Cubism and the idea of collage. But I love the way Bearden uses collage because it moves from being sort of a cerebral, semiotic theory thing about how art works to being really beautifully dovetailed in with African American experience. You could say, in a way, that African American experience itself is a collage. It has deep origins in Africa, in whatever region or tribe or environment slaves were taken from. And the memory of that, the art in that earlier part, the clothing design, the colors, that's still very much part of the psyche, even of the American slave. And it still continues all the way through today, and there's been revivals of those kinds of African forms back from days before slavery. And so that's a strong piece, a fragment, if you will. But people were ripped from that. They were torn from that. And then there's the slave experience, which has its own forms. And then the Civil War rips them from that. And then they're plunged into Jim Crow America, and then moved from that. So that there is, in a sense, a series of disruptions in the experience of blacks who live in this country. Whereas many of our life narratives are much more continuous and fluid. They flow one thing into another rather than being torn one thing from another. So Bearden does this brilliant use of collage to get at this. And as you look at the pieces here, some are little bits of photographs of African sculpture. Others are bits of photographs from contemporary life. So look in the upper left corner there. You see a locomotive chugging along with a church tower and a cross behind it. Whereas you can see bits of African masks in the other parts. And in the end, he creates this kind of abstract but referential collage work that really gets at the experience of his people. Okay, let's turn to yet another phenomena, um, which is Midwest painting. This needs a little context. Um, in this era, 20s, 30s, 40s, when there's such a debate going on about what is American identity, what is American soul and psyche, um, different regions began to emerge clearly. And there was a group of painters coming from the Midwest who claimed that the most American experience was the Midwestern experience. As a result, these painters tended to be called American scene painters, or maybe a little bit more important term, regionalists. And their argument was that each region had its own identity, and they liked the Midwest, although they were certainly familiar with other regions. Um, so East Coast, Midwest, South, West, Far West, these become different definitions of American experience. Now, one of the most powerful of these painters was Thomas Hart Benton, and you can see here his painting City Arts that I'll talk about in a moment. Benton actually had been to Europe. He had studied art in Paris. He knew modernism there. He had worked on the East Coast a lot, but ultimately he moved back to Missouri, Midwest, and felt that was the most American of experiences. Now, as he's exploring this idea, he does 4 mural-sized paintings called the American Arts. One is this one, City Arts, East Coast. One is the Midwest, one is the South, one's the Far West. And what he's trying to do here is kind of catalog forms of expression that are inherently American. So let's look at the one he does of City Arts, East Coast stuff. So at first look, this is a pretty wild painting. There's little vignettes popping all over with very active figures that are quite elongated. Now that elongation, that abstraction, actually tracks back to his experience with European art, but he rejected the abstraction of it. He liked the vibrancy of almost a Renaissance kind of quality, but of slightly exaggerated figures. So what has he given us here as City Arts? Let's start in the lower right corner of this painting, where you see that young woman in a yellow dress standing there, hanging from a subway strap. This little vignette is a cross-section of the subway, one of the most important East Coast New York City forms of transportation. And packed into this subway, you have a whole range of humanity. This young woman with her red hat and her high-heeled shoes, her stockings rolled down to her ankle, the kind of red dress, the sexy body. She actually represents the working girl, which is a new phenomenon in American culture. Women in the city not staying home and being domestic, but getting out into the workplace. So as she stands there writing, ignoring the men, next to her is a man in a blue suit. So here we have a businessman. Next to him is an African-American man with a cap and a tie. He's coming from the trades. And next to that, a man with a newspaper and a bowler hat. This is a cross-section of American types that we encounter. Now, look again at the woman in the yellow dress there, and move your eye now to the center of the painting. You see another woman who's in the same gesture, but this time kneeling with her arms both raised up. She is a woman attending a religious revival meeting, and there she is kneeling in prayer, kind of an ecstatic, charismatic moment. To her left are 2 figures kneeling down and praying. Above her is a man. This is the preacher. He's in her gesture but flipped as he raises the Bible up to the heavens and preaches kind of a fundamentalist revival message of God's love, which you see there in the center on a sign on his pulpit. Ben's claiming this is an American art form, all right, the revivalist preacher, and that this gets to the American sensibility of fundamentalist religion. Now, between our woman in ecstasy and our bowler-hatted man, you get a little glimpse out into the street, where you see a marching band, a music band coming down the street. This is the Salvation Army. And this references marching band music, which Benton says is another American form. You'll notice how he's embracing forms that are very populist, that are not, quote, highbrow art forms. Now let's go upwards in the painting there, where you see a boxing ring. Two men slugging it out, others cheering. This also, Benton says, is a very American art form, boxing, athleticism. Now let's move to the far left, where you see another woman in a red dress, head thrown back, echoing the position of our revival woman praying and our city girl riding the subway. Ben's repeated this shape 3 times, but now we're in a very sexy woman who's doing a striptease in a burlesque club, and you get a view up her derriere. And she is the flip ecstasy of the preacher there. This music, the strip club, burlesque, vaudeville, Benton says, are also very American forms. This is populist entertainment. In fact, it's still true today, where our major forms are populist and not highbrow. Now, let's look at the way this is composed. These different vignettes are all kind of chopped up. And that might be an echo of Cubism, which Benton was familiar with, but more likely it's a quoting from the cover page of part of the Sunday New York Times. Every Sunday, the Times put out a section that was about events around town. And they would have photographs of different events in the city, compiled in little vignettes and divided with little picture framing devices to give you sort of a pastiche, not quite a collage, but a pastiche of events from the week. Benton's quoting that here. And in that, he's referencing yet another American art, which is the newspaper. Near this time, the American philosopher John Dewey had actually published an essay about Americanness and had argued that it might be that the closest to American literature was not the novel, but was the newspaper. So Benton here capturing a very vibrant, pulsing, somewhat garish, somewhat kitschy, lowbrow cross-section of culture as the city arts. That's us. All right, let's look at one other American scene regionalist Midwest painter, Grant Wood. Super famous painting, American Gothic. You all probably have seen it. This is the quintessence of this American regionalist idea. Now, Grant Wood studied in Germany, and I encourage you to remember now back to Jan van Eyck, Robert Campan. For example, Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini wedding portrait, where we had that meticulous, detailed realism, full of embedded symbols and references. Grant Wood's all over that, but now he's applying that in Iowa to 20th century farmers. So here we have our farming couple. Wood actually meant this to be an older farmer and his spinster daughter, but everyone took it to be a farmer and his wife, which annoyed him to no end. Kind of cut out the irony a little bit of the painting. But there we have them up front, him holding this pitchfork, which is a symbol of his tools, of course, but also is a little bit of a warning of us to keep our distance. Notice how the tines of that pitchfork are echoed in the sewing of his bib overalls. Wood loves building this kind of embedded reference. He's there in his Sunday best, black go-to-church jacket, clean bib overalls, white shirt buttoned up. She's in her Sunday best, the kind of gingham dress with the white rickrack border that she would have sewn by hand, wearing that little cameo jewelry there at her throat. That was the height of hot jewelry at the time. Notice to her left, the porch. You can see all her house plants have been brought out, whereas to his right, the barn, the red barn. These tell us about her work and his work. Between them, the farmhouse with the pointed Gothic window at the top, referencing their religious sensibility. A stern painting, and yet a kind of, I love these guys, even though they're really salt of the earth, sober, serious folks. This is a great icon of the American Midwest. Lastly, I want to look at another dimension of American art in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, another region. And you're kind of getting the message by now, this sort of complexity of American continent with its regions and aesthetics coming out of that. So what I want to look at now is a group. Well, I'll just look at two, but there was a group of Mexican artists who actually were very successful in Mexico, but during the Depression came up to the United States and took part in the work projects, administration commissions to celebrate American culture. One of those is Diego Rivera. And we're going to go to Detroit and look at a commission he did for Henry Ford in the Henry Ford manufacturing plant where they made automobiles. So that's right down Rivera's alley. He's very interested in manufacturing and industry. He, however, is a political leftist coming from an influence by Karl Marx and socialism. And while he celebrates the American worker and the union worker, he's often critical of the American politician. Now, we're going to look at a complicated commission here. You're in the courtyard here of what is now the Detroit Institute of Arts, but was then part of Henry Ford's industrial complex. Here, Rivera is given a commission to paint the manufacture of the Ford automobile, but he wants to paint it in its totality. So you can see there's different parts of paintings on the wall here. I'm going to show you a diagram so that we can try to get at the complexity of this commission, and then we'll look at one wall from this composition. So here's a diagram of the total program of this commission. It's got a lot of parts. So you can see there at the center the garden court of the Detroit Institute of Arts. So that's where we are in that courtyard. And then you can see the four walls going up and all kinds of different themes being portrayed on them. If you look at the two bigger walls just to the left and right of that flat square of the courtyard floor, you see that the theme there is the making of the automobile. So on the left, making of the motor of the automobile at the Ford Rouge plant. On the right, making the body of the automobile at the Ford Rouge plant. So this is about manufacturing automobiles, and we'll talk a little bit more when I show you a detail of those in a moment. But I also want you to notice there's all kinds of other things happening there. So look, for example, at the making of the motor of the automobile, and just above that to the left, a strip of fossils and crystals. That's a cross-section of the earth, as I'll show you in a moment. Rivera wants to show the earth from which the minerals come that enable us to make that automobile. And then above that, black race, below it red race, in the middle hands, volcanoes, hands. Rivera is also showing us the different racial makeup of humanity around the entire globe. And some of the religious dimensions of it. There's more, but that gives you an idea. Let's go and look at a couple of details, and you can help. It'll help you be able to understand what I'm talking about here. Now, here is one wall in that courtyard, and in the largest painting there, the kind of long rectangular horizontal painting there just off the floor, you see the inside of a factory where they're manufacturing automobile motors. Let's linger on that for a minute because this is Ford, right? So Ford invented the assembly line, which gave a whole new meaning to labor and also made automobiles affordable to the common family. So this is about workers, about manufacturing. About male macho making of things, and we're going to look at a detail of that in a minute to get up closer, but keep that in mind. But for the minute, look above that manufacturing scene. There's a narrow horizontal painting. That's where you saw the crystals and the silicone. This is a cross-section of the earth, and Rivera wants us to know that when you drive that automobile around, it wasn't produced magically, it didn't grow on a tree. It came from the earth, from the minerals. So that car is linked to nature, to geology, to long geological time. Then look above that and you see another narrow horizontal painting where you see two kind of monumental, almost godlike figures reclining. Between them is a mountain with hands. Each hand is holding a nugget from the earth. So this is pushing even deeper into history, deep time, almost mythic time with those godlike figures in the earth, and then hands with the crystals, the minerals that come from the earth. While we're here, notice the two square paintings, far upper left, far upper right. These are actually about modern science and the things we also get from the earth in terms of modern science. In that upper right corner, a little hard to see here, you have a scene where a child, a baby, almost a baby, is actually getting a vaccination. And Rivera here is talking about modern science, modern medicine, and how it can be used to heal. So this is a scene of progress, just like the car is progress. But if you look at the upper left corner, there you see some guys in gas masks and suited up in a laboratory. These guys are developing chemical warfare weapons. And Rivera is saying to us, look what humanity is. We come out of deep history, out of geology, out of the richness of the minerals. We have science, we have progress, but we also have horrific warfare and monstrous things that we produce. This is a complicated view of humanity. And Rivera is kind of bringing us into that all at once. Okay, now getting into a detail of that wall, you see here Rivera's heroes, the worker, the male worker. Now, Rivera is a Marxist coming out of a socialist political theory, and he adores the idea of the worker, the common man who's unionized, who manufactures and produces this throbbing industrial society with its machines, automobiles that go up and down and give us freedom. In the back there you see the foundry, the fire. This is where the steel is manufactured, and then the steel parts of the automobile are carried on overhead conveyor belts down to where this assembly line of men put it together. This is labor as heroic, and Rivera deeply believes in that. Okay, we're going to look at one other painter here. So I want to conclude with one last painter, Frida Kahlo, also a part of this movement of Mexican art that's so powerful at the time. Kahlo is actually married to Rivera. They have a very fierce marriage, very passionate. They get divorced and remarried and divorced and remarried and so on. It's a pretty wild situation, actually. But I love pairing Kahlo with Rivera. Because Kahlo is a whole different kind of artist. She's a very personal, very psychological artist, dealing mostly with self-portraits, whereas Rivera's out there fighting the wars of Marxism. She's here doing very intimate self-portraits. And by the way, most of her work is self-portrait that comes from how she became an artist. As a girl, a teenager, she was in a terrible tram accident. A metal rod was shoved up actually through her vagina, up through her body, and she spent years and years in bed, recovering from surgeries, wearing body casts. And after some of these surgeries, still as a teenager, she had to stay in bed with a body cast. Her bed was one of those four posters with a canopy above it. And her parents put a mirror in that canopy so she could see herself. And her mother bought her a paint box so that she could paint as a way of recovering. The idea was just this is sort of therapy, but she became an artist out of it. And what did she have to paint when she couldn't move? Well, there was her mirror, her image of herself. And she began to do self-portraits, partly to explore the trauma of what had happened to her, of all the pain and suffering in her life because of this accident and years of surgery. And as a result, she became invested in self-portrait as a way to examine who one is. I'm showing you here a double self-portrait, two Fridas, where she sits side by side to herself, holding her own hand. On the left, dressed in a kind of Mexican wedding dress. On the right, dressed in a dress that references actually her ethnic background of indigenous peoples, Native American peoples in Mexico. Um, in a way, these are her two identities. If we say, what are we? Who are we? Well, one of the answers to that is, where do we come from ethnically and in our family tree? So here she gives us two Fridas bound together by pain. The Frida in the white wedding dress has her chest opened up, surgery has been performed, and her heart has been hung over the other Frida, connected by a blood vessel, while in the meantime another blood vessel is pinched off by surgical clamps by the Frida in the white dress, while the Frida in the native dress holds a snail, which is a symbolic reference to her spiritual ancestral origins in indigenous peoples. It's a really powerful self-portrait, double self-portrait, very psychological and symbolic. Now, she is partly relating here to the surrealist way of working. We looked at surrealism last time. She is aware of European surrealism, but I think important to say she arrives at this way of working way before she knew European surrealism, and it would be wrong to put her in a box of, oh, she's a European surrealist in Mexico. She's really a Mexican painter, deeply plunging into her experience and using things that the surrealists also used to get at the inner psyche. All right, that's as much as we have time for American art. Our course does end with World War II, and these artists are powerful 1920s and 30s, at which point we need to end our course. So, last lecture. All right, we'll connect in other ways soon.